My name is Conrad Karageorge. I am the president of the Notre Business Society, and I would like to offer you a warm welcome to the Future Leaders Forum, our inaugural event held by the Mancal Economic Education Foundation and the Notre Business Society. The forum allows students and interested parties to discuss the current economic, political and social issues we're currently facing. Tonight's presentation will be on Western Australia, our past, our present, our future, the social, economic issues that face us nationally and internationally. I'm delighted to say that we have here tonight as our guest speaker the Honourable Richard Court, former Premier of Western Australia. In addition to Mr. Court, we also have Tom Camp, a Notre Dame student and former Mancal scholar, who will be sharing his experiences whilst on a Mancal scholarship in Sydney with you tonight. First, however, I'd like to turn you over to CEO of Mancal, Paul McCarthy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thanks, Conrad. Well, welcome everyone. Good evening. I'm Paul McCarthy. Thanks. I'm the new CEO of the Mancal Economic Education Foundation since about the last couple of months. Now, Mancal is a free market think tank based here in WA. We run a lot of events to help people understand what liberty, free markets are, how they can be perfected and perpetuated. We put out a lot of policy documents as well to try and influence current political debate. One of the main functions that we do, however, is that we run a scholarship program to send young students on internships and to conferences interstate and overseas. We currently have people about to leave for Sydney and Hong Kong. We also have a student right now in Vancouver. Some have recently come back from Auckland. So Mancal is a passport to the world. Now, it's been a bit of a full circle for me personally. I was a Mancal scholar about 10 years ago. I went on an internship to Sydney, to the Centre for Independent Studies, just like Tom Camp did, who we'll hear from just shortly. Had a fantastic time, learned everything that I thought I knew about free markets, but just couldn't quite verbalise, couldn't quite put into practice myself. Came back and found that my Mancal internship was a great boost to my CV, and it kick-started me into my first job here in Perth in the energy sector. Decided to move up to London for a while, as a lot of people do. I made the worst possible mistake I could. I left just as the financial crisis was kicking off, and jobs in London were about as rare as snowflakes in Saudi Arabia. So I was sitting there, middle of winter, -5 degrees, in a share house with about 8 other Australians in London. All qualified, experienced, sitting there feeling depressed that they couldn't get a job. And then suddenly the phone rang. It was the call for me, and the voice on the other end said, "Oh, is this Paul McCarthy?" I said, "Yes, it is." Said, "We understand that you're a former scholar of the Mancal Economic Education Foundation from Western Australia." I said, "Yes, I am." "Well, we'd like to meet you. Would you like to come in for an appointment?" Things went from there, and I found myself in my first job in London, and a very high-flying consulting job, fortunately. That led me on to a second job time later, helping the government to figure out how they were going to deal with the issues related to renewable energy and building enough power generators for the UK, and end up being promoted from that to a role actually regulating the entrance of Chinese investment into the gas market in the UK, which was a very crucial function up in the United Kingdom. Decided to come back to Perth, and I found again that through being a Mancal scholar, it opened up a lot of doors that I didn't even know existed, and it brought me to the position I am at today, such that I've been able to become the Mancal CEO, and now I have the opportunity to give back to all the young people who I see before me tonight and at the universities, and see faces that we're at the same point I was at about 10 years ago. We're really excited about the year ahead. Last year we had 51 students go through Mancal internships. We're doubling that this year to 105 students. So we're looking for good young people who we can send out as ambassadors. If you're interested in liberty, in finance, markets, economics, how international trade works, get in touch with us at Mancal. It will be the best thing you ever did. Now, you don't necessarily have to be a student to be involved with Mancal. We have an ambassadors program going for people who are perhaps a bit above the student age. There are a lot of ways to get involved. We have events, we have, as I mentioned, our policy papers, and we're always looking for people to get involved, support Mancal and support the great group of young students that we have going out to represent WA around the world and come back as WA's future leaders. So thank you for your time so far. What I'd like to do now is introduce Tom Camp. As I mentioned, recently went to Sydney to the Centre for Independent Studies as a Mancal scholar, and as I understand had a fantastic time over there and learned a great deal from the experience. So Tom, I'll let you fill in everyone with how it went. Thank you.
Now, I wasn't sure that I was supposed to be talking about my time over in Sydney, so I haven't actually prepared for that. But I can tell you it was an exceptional experience, and I encourage everyone here to apply for the Mancal scholarships, because they're definitely a worthwhile experience. But yes, tonight we have come together to discuss the future of Western Australia. It is apt that young leaders turn their minds to this topic, and I have no doubt that this room contains a number of people who have the capacity to do wonderful things for WA. That Mancal is supporting this project in coordination with the Notre Business Society is another welcome act by an organisation that has already done so much to further the education of so many. By helping to teach the importance of the individual, Mancal is making leaders out of us all. I would like to take this time to discuss something that is very important to the future of this state. Nothing else so aptly illustrates the wrong turn that too many Western Australians are willing to take. The evil I am talking about is, of course, the curse of the speed bump. Like nothing else do I hate them, and concerningly, they are becoming even more prevalent. As I will explain, speed bumps show the concerning lack of leadership people are willing to take in their lives. I had driven the same stretch of road parallel to the train line in Bayswater my entire driving life and the entirety of my passenger life. The feeling I had for Railway Parade is as close to love as a man can have with a road. I've never seen nor heard of an accident occurring on this stretch of safe street. Sadly, as is true with all love stories that don't end in death, it ended in dismay. Like an attractive and well-toned partner that suddenly packs on lumps of fat, so too my road had become worthy of a Black Eyed Peas song about its humps. It now had speed bumps. My cousin works for a council, and I remonstrated with him for his evil work, caring very little that he's employed by the city of Coburn and not Bayswater. Once he had calmed me, he explained that often it has nothing to do with road safety, but it's householders' complaints that prompt council action. Here is the issue. For too long have the people of WA looked at a problem or even had a concern and begged government, local, state or Commonwealth to fix it. This state is crying out for leaders. We need leaders who would realise that the best fix is one that comes from an individual. Be not like the overly concerned Bayswater residents who empower the overbearing actions of government. If you have a problem, you should fix it without calling the bureaucrats. I hope that increasingly this state can produce leaders who think and act for themselves, and I believe this initiative between Mancal and the Notre Business Society will prove to encourage this sense of empowered individualism. As we approach the end of the mining boom, WA will undoubtedly face a number of challenges. Let us not once more turn to the state, but instead turn within, to solve the future problems that we face. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Very entertaining speech, and congratulations. Now, you'll forgive me for reading off notes, but our next speaker has a fantastic pedigree, extremely impressive as our former Premier. First, though, may I acknowledge the presence tonight of one of our guests, Mick Mauzan, the President of the Ukrainian Association of WA. Very pleased to have you here tonight. Now, to our guest speaker, Richard Court, AC, was elected to the seat of Nedlands in the State Parliament in 1982 upon the retirement of his father, Sir Charles Court. Richard was elevated to the shadow frontbench in 1984, serving as the opposition spokesman for resources and industrial development, mines and Aboriginal affairs. He became deputy leader of the Liberal Party in 1987 and leader in 1992. Now, I remember well the 1993 election. I'm at that point in life, I'm 34 years old, and I now understand that there are people who, when I talk about things that happened when I was young, some of those people weren't yet born. So I'm getting that, starting to approach the top of the hill there, point, Paul. But I remember that 1993 election. And that was the election that brought the coalition government back to power and Richard Court to the position of Premier. My family were jumping for joy. It was after the disasters of the Burke, Dowding and Lawrence governments. The WA Inc. years had proved an absolute disaster for WA and embarrassed us around the planet. And everyone was thankful that finally Richard Court had become Premier and we were going to have good, solid, sensible, reasonable government. And that's what it was widely acknowledged as being until they handed over the reins in 2001. There was a number of very successful reforms and projects, including restoring the state's finances post-WA Inc., opening up the LNG market to China, privatising SGIO, Bankwest, Westrail Freight, Alinta and the Dampier-Bunbury gas pipeline, deregulating the WA gas market, planning the Perth to Mandurah railway link, and my favourite, I use it every day, thank you Richard, planning and building the Graham Farmer Freeway. You've saved many, many days of my life accumulatively so far for that one. Now, since leaving politics, Richard's held a number of consulting and board positions, including chairmanships at Iron Ore Holdings Limited, GRD Limited, Resource Investments Strategy Consultants and the Channel 7 Telethon Trust. Richard tonight will discuss his perspective on politics as practiced today and relative to the times of both himself and his father, Sir Charles. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to present the Honourable Richard Court.
Well, thank you very much to Paul. Thank you, Conrad. Tom, I like your style. It's good. To Ron and Jenny Manners and to all the friends and supporters of the Mannkal Foundation, thank you for the very kind invitation to speak at your Future Leaders Forum. You listen to the news every day and it's, there's wars going on, there's a lot of problems and a lot of political issues, etc. And, what's the future going to be like? And sometimes when I get a bit despaired, I then go and meet young people. I meet people like yourselves in this room that are going to become very soon our future leaders, and I have no worries about the future. There's a terrific, well-educated, committed generation of young people coming through. But to you, Ron, and to Jenny, thank you for taking the initiative to give more people the opportunity to understand what a true free enterprise world is. You know, how important it is that we live in a democracy with free markets and the like. So I've really enjoyed coming down to talk to you tonight. And this yacht club is sort of home base for me. The first 25 years of my life I basically spent at this club. I learned to swim here, I learned to sail, I learned how to build yachts, and my father was the patron for many, many decades. I've been the patron here for the last 30 years, so I'm coming back to a bit of home territory here. I would have walked here tonight, except the forecast said it was going to rain, so I didn't. But I'm also very pleased that I'm meeting you just a couple of days before some of you are heading off to the Samuel Griffith Society. They've got their annual conference in Melbourne this year. It's a conference that I rarely miss. And that particular society, you know, has its goal of, in a constructive way, trying to work out how we can strengthen our federation, the workings of our federation. It critiques the way in which our constitution, instead of just being negative, how it can be improved. But Ron, I've got to say, with the people that you send across there, you do sort of half the average age of the participants there. But it's even though there are a number of, should I say, mature people there, they are very, very experienced, knowledgeable people. A number of former High Court judges and the like, leaders from industry, and interesting, some cross-sections across politics. And I think it's important we do give up some time to see how we can make our federation work better. Tonight I've been asked to talk, and I apologise for those that are standing. I'll try not to be too long, but I've been asked to address sort of three questions. The first one was, what have our present state leaders learnt from our past? Well, I hope they've learnt a lot, and I hope the generation, yourselves, the younger generation coming through, also take the time to study our history. You go back to our first Premier, John Forrest, quite a remarkable person, and he really did do the hard yards before he became Premier. I suggest you don't follow his model, in that I think he physically walked across Australia twice. He was a great explorer, great surveyor. But the one lesson we learnt from John Forrest is that there was a gold rush in the 1890s. And he made sure that with that gold rush, that we were able to build some infrastructure, some long life, very effective infrastructure that was going to be important for generations to come. He was responsible for committing to the Goldfields water pipeline scheme. He had the foresight to hire an outstanding engineer in C.Y. O'Connor. And C.Y. O'Connor was an engineer in New Zealand. An Irishman went out to New Zealand. And it was interesting, John Forrest was at one of the many meetings they held in the 1890s to try and work up how they could bring the states together in a federation. And at a dinner one night, he said, they're just having a dinner talking, he said, look, I need a new chief engineer. Anyone got any ideas? And at the time, New Zealand was involved in those talks. New Zealand was considering to join the federation. And the New Zealand chap said, look, we've just appointed a new chief engineer and we've overlooked this bloke, C.Y. O'Connor. He's number 2, but he's excellent. And I suggest you grab him, which is what Forrest did. And it turned out to be a terrific choice. In New Zealand, he had built some amazing ports, some amazing roads across some very difficult country. And so Forrest gave us, with O'Connor, that Goldfields water pipeline scheme. Critical to the goldfields, but also it has been critical to opening up a large part of the agricultural region. He did Fremantle Harbour. Fremantle Harbour, before that, was a jetty out in the open sea, and They used they were first in the world to use underwater blasting technologies and the like, and they built the harbour. They rapidly expanded the railway network across our state. Forest battles weren't with the central government because there wasn't one then until we formed the Federation in 1901. But there were still some masters in England, in Westminster. And for example, the Royal Mint here, the people in London wanted to control how it was built, but Forrest very quickly learnt that communications in those days were by sea, and that took a long time, so you could effectively ignore most instructions that were coming out from London. But then you fast forward 80 years. So the lesson of Forrest is we've got strong revenues coming from this gold rush. Let's do something for future generations. You fast forward 80 years to my father's time, when you saw the foundations laid for the resource growth that occurred this time, not with gold so much as with iron ore, with alumina, with nickel, with diamonds and the like. And his legacy was to build the gas pipeline from the Pilbara down to the southwest, giving us another source of energy, gas, so that the coal industry had to face some competition. And that gas pipeline also underwrote the development of the North West Shelf Project's export LNG phase, and today that project is still Australia's largest, single, most successful, highest tax-paying project in our country today. And that was the sort of legacy that came out of that resource development starting in the early 60s. The standard gauge railway line was built to Kalgoorlie so we could then link up across the rest of the country with the same standard gauge railway and the like. So one of the lessons that we must learn is that we have a responsibility as leaders to be building infrastructure for the future. Unfortunately, in this country, too often we are lagging behind. There's no better example than a country like, as small as it is, Singapore. They always build their infrastructure ahead of demand, their airports, their railway systems and the like. And when you have that foresight and you put that infrastructure in place, it's amazing how the economy can grow behind it. We then, in simple terms, you could say that it is the leader's responsibility to make sure they leave the state in a better condition than when they arrive. Unfortunately, that was not the case with those Labor governments that we had during what Paul mentioned were the WA Inc. years. That period, and you're right, Paul, many people, younger people, don't understand what it was like going through when Burke was in power and the legacy that he left behind. But basically, in simple terms, they trashed the state's reputation and they trashed our state's finances. And it was the worst period of corruption in our state's relatively short history. And it has taken many years to repair that reputation. What we saw then was the Premier, Brian Burke, in cahoots with a small group of business people basically doing deals to benefit themselves but not the electorate. And interesting, what was the lessons learned out of that? Well, the Labor Party themselves learnt the lesson that the electorate does not accept a political party that are not good stewards of our state's finances and our state's reputation. So I had the privilege of being the Premier and the Treasurer for 8 years. When the Gallop government came in, followed by Carpenter's government, their Treasurer was Eric Ripper. He was relatively conservative. They learnt the lesson that if they wanted to be in government, they had to demonstrate they would spend the people's monies, because governments don't have any money. They just get their money from taxes and the like. And so I think that was one of the key lessons that were learnt. Now, the second question I was asked, would Sir Charles Court be running the state differently if he was Premier today? And I guess the simple answer is yes. But I want to explain that every generation does things a bit differently, but the basics remain the same. He came from a generation that he had to live through the Depression years in the 1930s. He actually started his own business then. He was a young accountant and he set up a practice during the Depression years. His clients were, he started his business with the banks. A lot of businesses were going broke, and the banks would give him clients of companies they had written off, and they said, if you can resurrect them, you've got a client and we'll be very grateful and pay you some fees. So he got a mix of clients who were businesses that were effectively broke. And he used to tell me, I was a commerce student myself, he'd tell me some fascinating stories. One of them was a major milk vendor in Kalgoorlie, and the bank said he's going broke, can't pay his bills, etc. So my father went to Kalgoorlie and spent a few days doing the milk rounds with him, just to see how this business worked. And he had a big business. And what happened in those Depression years, people would have a tab, and they, instead of paying for the milk, they'd build up the tab, and then when they had enough money or whatever, they would then pay the bill. Well, what my father quickly realised is that they were paying the bills, but they weren't using cash, they were using gold. And so the milk vendor was going broke in the bank's eyes, but he was a very wealthy man. And these are the sorts that, I guess the lesson you learn there is that you've got to be hands-on. You've got to get in there and find out just how the business is operating, etc. But that was the era that he came from, the tough times. No sooner had they come out of the Depression, when they had to go away for 5-6 years and fight in the Second World War. So my father came out of the Second World War, he had 5 young children, and he had to re-establish his accounting practice. And he'd only been doing that for about 8 years when in 1953 he was tapped on the shoulder and said, look, we'd like you to go into politics. So he went into politics. He had a successful accounting practice, but those years of his life, which would have been his prime years in the profession, he instead chose public service. And so you can see that in his life, in his mind, the Depression years and that period of fighting to protect our country were the big drivers in why he went into politics. He did not like the way the communists had been growing, and particularly the communists inside Australia during that Second World War and soon afterwards. You know, they were a generation that said, we're not going to fight for democracy in this country and then have a sort of left-wing organisation like the Communist Party at the time take it over. And so that was the driving force of a lot of those people that were coming back from the Second World War. So you can see what was driving them. By the time he became a minister and the Premier and the Treasurer, you know, their basic instincts, they were frugal, but fortunately they were also very far-sighted. And they laid those foundations for that incredible growth that we've had in our economy that we are the beneficiaries of. So you could say a very, very disciplined person. And then along comes the son. I'm a different generation. Born after the war, no depression, no world war. We had the Vietnam War, but I was one of the baby boomers. And for us, the good times are meant to run forever. And we've had it relatively easy in some senses, but the way in which we operate, again, is different than the Gen X's and the Gen Y's that are coming after us. But what I want to say is there are some of those generational changes, but the basics of leadership do not change, and they will never change. You know, leadership is something that's pretty simple. It doesn't matter whether you're running the country, running this yacht club, running your school P&C or whatever. It's all about, if you are prepared to commit to do something, you've then got to do it, and you have to do it to the best of your ability. Leadership is about people that are prepared to put their hands up and say, I'll take on that responsibility, but then get on and get it done. You're not a gunner person, you actually get on and do it. At whatever level you choose, in society to show leadership. So leaders are not complainers, they're not whingers. They are people that sit down and work out how they can resolve a problem, how they can resolve an issue in a constructive way, work through it and perform. And there are many different ways in which we can show leadership in our community. It goes without saying that with leaders you have to be polite, you have to have good manners, you have to have humility, and you've certainly got to show a lot of common sense. And that's why Clive Palmer will never be a good leader. And Clive Palmer is the exact opposite. Clive Palmer is a populist. And it's happening, this is a lesson that you will learn, it's happening in front of your eyes. I've seen it happen a few times. I saw it happen with Pauline Hanson. And a populist wants to be all things to all people. If you have a look at the front page of The Australian today, where they had Clive, his views on China and climate change, etc., only over a 3-year period. It completely goes from one side to the other, whatever's the popular thing for him to say on the day. And one thing that I was taught very early is that popularity is like an ice cream. It melts very quickly. But respect is something that you can only earn the hard way. And you've got to put in the hard yards to earn it. You know, it comes back to the first question, you know, what are the lessons learnt from previous leaders? And one of the lessons, of course, is that you have to be a strong, ethical person, because, you know, good reputations, they don't just come and you keep it, you've got to constantly keep working at it. You know, there's an old saying that a journalist is only as good as their last story. Well, your reputation, if you've got a good reputation, it's only as good as your last act. You've got to keep working on it. It's like strong families. Strong families don't just happen, you're not born with them. Strong families only happen because there are people, mothers and fathers, that are prepared to keep working at it the whole time. When people are going off the track a bit, you know, certain weaknesses, etc., everyone has to get behind to help, to build it up. And they are the lessons that you learn in life. I was just reading the paper this morning on reputations, you know, just consumer brands. I see Maggie B has got into a bit of trouble because her products all have made in Barossa. And it turns out that some of them are made in Queensland and Victoria. And quite correctly, she's been called to account. And so she's had a terrific reputation. I've got no doubt she will very quickly get over that sort of hiccup. But you've got to keep working at it all the time if you want to have that good reputation. And that's one of the essentials of good leadership. The third question was, should WA continue to give more than we receive? And I assume that we're talking about this issue of the monies that are made in Western Australia and then redistributed to the other states. Now, the point I want to make here is that many of you are at university, or it's very important that we deal with the facts when we are addressing this particular issue. And let's go back a few steps, right back to John Forrest, when he was negotiating for us to have to enter the Federation. The biggest concern that Western Australia has was that we would lose our financial autonomy. And we had good monies coming in. We had certain taxes, particularly with the gold rush, customs duties and the like, that were giving us a strong revenue stream. Well, of course, the states were promised that with this new federation, you will always have your financial autonomy. Well, of course, the exact opposite has occurred. Within a few years, certain decisions were made. Then over decades, certain High Court rulings have been made. And we've just seen this gradual more and more of the financial muscle going across to the central government. To the point today, the central government has all the major growth revenues, the company taxes and the income taxes and the like, and the states are left with some quite inefficient taxes. But one of the taxes that the states share is the GST. Now, I'll come back to that. In the 1930s, Western Australia's concern about the deal it was getting in the Federation became so strong there was a vote for secession. And as many of you know, there was a 2/3 majority vote for Western Australia to secede from the Federation. And when they tried to do that, the government in the Westminster said, no, we can only progress this if the authority comes from our central government for Western Australia to secede, which of course didn't happen. But it scared the central government enough to say, well, they're pretty grumpy over there in the West. And that's when they set up the Commonwealth Grants Commission. And the purpose of the Commonwealth Grants Commission was to ensure that all the states were able to deliver roughly the same level of basic services in health and education and infrastructure and the like. And of course, through the history of Western Australia, most of the time until recent years, we have been what is called a mendicant state. We have been a beneficiary of getting more money than we have been contributing. Well, in recent decades, that's completely turned around. And you hear all the figures that are coming through about how we're down to whatever it is, 50 cents in the dollar, and getting less of our share of the GST revenues that are collected. Now, what the GST is, it's a broad-based consumption tax which replaced what the states used to collect. The states used to collect taxes on fuel, tobacco, liquor, etc., until a High Court ruling came down saying what the states were doing was unconstitutional. So very quickly the federal government had to step in, collect those taxes on behalf of the states, and then they came up with this concept of a broader-based goods and services tax, which I think is a much more efficient way than what was being done before. What the issue is today is not about the operations of the goods and services tax, it's about the way in which the Commonwealth Grants Commission is allocating funds between the states and territories. And the reason that we get a lesser and lesser share is because we're getting a lot of other revenue in, particularly from royalties. So it's not as if we're sort of super short of money, there's a lot of money coming in. But the concern is that the way the formula is working for the Grants Commission, it's not properly taking into account the requirements that a growing state like us has, particularly with infrastructure, with roads, with health, with education, in remote areas, in the Pilbara. They don't fully understand the costs involved of providing those services in some of these regions. But instead of complaining about it, I believe we have a responsibility to put forward constructive proposals that a central government, regardless of the political persuasion, can introduce to give the states access to a new growth revenue source. If it's too hard to give us back income taxing powers, which we had until they were removed, taken away in the Second World War, not removed constitutionally, but in all practical purposes they have been. So yes, if you can come up with a sharing arrangement for income tax, that'd be great. But the proposal that I put forward, and this is why think tanks and organisations are so important, think out of the square. Think of providing the government of the day or a future government a way in which the states can again get more financial autonomy, which we were promised. And the proposal that I've been pushing is to do with the sharing of the royalties that are going to come from the next generation of offshore LNG projects, most of them in Western Australia. Not onshore, because they come from, they already pay state royalties. But offshore, we've got the Gorgon project, currently under construction. We've got Wheatstone, we've got the Ixios project, we've got the Prelude project. And what will happen, and very few people understand who gets the royalties. Even Wayne Swan never understood it. The royalties from the North West Shelf project, under an agreement reached between my father and Malcolm Fraser are split roughly 70-30. 70% of the royalties come to Western Australia and 30% to the central government. Of the 70% we get under the Grants Commission, a large part of that is redistributed to the other states. So the more successful Western Australia is with its resources, with the royalties it receives, the more all the other states make. With these next generation of projects, they're operating under a new tax system, a petroleum resource rent tax. 100% of those royalties goes to the central government. None of them come to the state. And my proposal is that we should have a similar arrangement to the North West Shelf project. I believe that that next new stream of revenues, the PRRT revenues, should be split 50-50. 50% goes to the central government and 50% goes to the states, all the states, shared on a per capita basis. So Tasmania, South Australia, everyone gets a share of the royalties coming. So the states will get access to a new growth revenue source. And it is going to be a massive new source of revenues. Now, it won't kick in until about 8 years after the projects come into production. So if Gorgon comes into production next year, in 8 years' time, that new revenue stream will start flowing. So there's plenty of time for governments, central and state governments, to plan for how they will handle that new revenue source. So to me, it's important that we come up with what I think are, in this case, a pretty simple, constructive proposal. It's effectively what we've already got for the North West Shelf project, so that we can plan ahead knowing that the states will again start to get a new growth revenue stream. Otherwise, what's going to happen? This massive new revenue stream is all going to go into the centre. And we're going to end up with the Kevin Rudds and the Wayne Swans, and it may well be the Costellos and the John Howards, telling the states how much money they're going to get, how the distribution of those monies that are Commonwealth monies are going to be spent. And you know, we don't get a very good call out of that because we don't have the numbers. We don't have the population numbers here. And quite frankly, I believe if there is not genuine reforms made to revenue sharing within the Federation, we're going to have a lot of unrest in this country. So that, in brief terms, I guess, is your third question about the financial arrangements. Instead of complaining and whinging about it, by all means highlight what the problem is, but then come up with some practical solutions. If you can work out how we can go back to sharing income tax streams, well and good. I think it's politically pretty hard. But what I like about this PRRT stream is it's still out beyond the forward estimates, and it's just a matter of locking the political parties into place now. Because the closer we get to that time, when that massive revenue stream starts flowing, Sir Humphrey in Canberra is not going to want to let go of it. Full stop. So there needs to be some hard decisions made now to get that sort of policy put in place. So with those comments, I will, in relation to the question about would my father be doing things differently today, the basic principles of leadership never change. In relation to our state being a strong, resource-driven state, what he always pushed for, and would be pushing for strongly today, is for us to be making better use of our natural resources by insisting that the companies extracting them invested more in value adding to those resources. So instead of our gas just being shipped overseas as LNG, to encourage it being value added into fertilisers, into chemicals and the like. And similarly with all the minerals that we've got. Indonesia's having a stab at it, and they're being criticised at present, but it could well be that Indonesia ends up with some pretty sophisticated value-adding mineral industries there. And I think that would be one of the major changes. Natural resources are finite. Once you've dug them and shipped them, they're gone. And if you can work out how to add more value to them, it's going to be to the benefit of this country. So look, with those words, I'm sorry to keep you standing so long, but if you want some questions and answers, only too willing to try. Thank you.
A bit of Q&A?
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And Richard, that was a brilliant speech. I loved hearing back about the WA Inc. years, as well as your views on leadership, which I'm sure the students here tonight will really be able to take on board. Can I invite from the floor any questions? I might kick it off. Richard, you mentioned about WA being considered a mendicant state in previous decades. I've heard an argument going around, and this is one of those contentious things. The eastern states say we were mendicants, some people here say we weren't. But I heard one argument that a lot of the payments that used to come from the eastern states to WA were not welfare payments for a mendicant state as such. They're partly to compensate WA as an exporter for the high tariffs that were slapped on us to protect Victorian manufacturing and so forth. Do you have any views on that?
Look, the way in which a central government allocates funds to the states has varied over the years. But one of the biggest grumbles that we have had is that our economy here has been based on agricultural and basically primary production, agricultural and mining industries where there's no protection. Whereas the East Coast has had very high levels of protection, which only in recent decades has been wound back in textiles, and just the last ones, of course, have been in the automobile industry. And yeah, that's been, I mean, the strength of the Western Australian economy today, the fact that this state is now producing more than 50% of Australia's physical export income, it's quite a remarkable performance. It's not understood by most politicians in Canberra, and it is not understood by most people living on the East Coast. I'll just briefly, without trying to be too political, when Kevin Rudd came into government, you had this situation. Sure, there was a GFC, but we drove through that with the performance of China. You know, China kept wanting more of our energy, our iron ore and our coal and the like. And I heard this story that in the early days of the Rudd government, he came here and he did a trip up through the Pilbara. He had a look at the new gas projects and the expansions of the new mines and the like. He flew back to the east and he was at a private breakfast, business breakfast in Sydney. And his comments were along the lines of, this country does not have to worry about its debt levels. There is going to be so much money coming from the expansion in the resource sector. So what do they dream up? They dream up a resource super profits tax, which was to get more tax from an industry that already had to pay company tax. It already has to pay royalties to the state for getting access to those minerals, or royalty streams to the central government. And even in Wayne Swan's book that's been released this week, he says things like the resource companies were getting access to the resources for nothing. I mean, you only have to have a look at our state budget, which is up over $20 billion now, to see how important. I mean, just the decline in iron ore prices has taken $1.5 billion off their revenue streams. That shows you the extent of how much money the companies are paying in royalties and the like. So unfortunately, we had this situation where the money's been coming too easily. The success of the resource industry has made governments slack in how they handle their own finances. And there's an old saying that I love. Sometimes you get the best governments in the worst times, and you get the worst governments in the best times. And I think that's what we have seen in recent years. In answer to your question, we're one of the few countries in the world where governments have actually had too much money.
question. Productivity, competitiveness, cost blowouts, deferrals, reviews, all these sorts of macro problems. You got a quick suggestion as to what might help solve that?
Yeah, at the end of the day, market forces work. We have had this incredible investment era with the mining expansions and the oil and gas expansions. There's been a shortage of skilled labour. Prices have gone through the roof. Construction periods are starting to wind back in the mining industry. What's happening is all those super duper salaries are starting to disappear, and market forces are at work. All the good people inside government were going out to work in the private sector. Now the government's got a queue of people wanting to come back in again. And so a bit of reality is setting in and market forces are working. Where you do have a productivity front is where market forces don't work, and that's where you have sort of like government monopolies in place. And I've always been a huge fan of how courageous Maggie Thatcher was. Because one of the key things she did, which was then followed by Western governments around the world, she exposed government monopolies to competition. They could not control productivity levels, wages and the like inside government monopolies. But once they were exposed to competition, market forces kicked in, and even if you look at Australia, one of Keating's one of his big initiatives was introducing a competition policy in Australia. It was pure Thatcher policy, introduced by a Labor government, and what it did was expose government monopolies, mainly state government monopolies, power utilities and the like, to competition. So I'm a big believer that the market works. We've been through a time it's been a bit surreal. In our lifetime, we will never see another China story. I mean, it's remarkable the way that's unfolded in front of our eyes. We've been through Japan's growth after the Second World War. That was pretty good, but it plateaued in the 70s and hasn't shifted much from then. We then saw Korea take off, but we've never seen something of the scale of China. And we haven't really taken advantage of it. And things are getting a bit tougher in China, and they're not going to be made any easier by our mate Clive, the way he's performing. Will India become another country? India will move, but it won't be the same sort of story. It'll move in a different way, but I think India will become a good market for us, particularly with energy. We're seeing a lot of increased activity on the energy front with Indian companies. But at the end of the day, it's market forces. If unions hold out for excessive wage increases, etc., at the end of the day, the jobs are lost. That's one of the reasons I went into politics. I mean, in the early 80s, you had incredibly high levels of youth unemployment. Young people were being locked out of the market by restrictive practices inside unions. I mean, there are still some professions today, the waterfront and the like, you've got to be a member of the family to get in. But fortunately, even competition is starting to work in some of those areas.
Thank you.
I just have a question. Are there any, on the subject of public monopolies, are there any more things you'd like to see privatised within government?
Oh, look, it's a difficult question. I think the easiest ones have been done in most states. When I say the easiest ones, the ones where you can sell the government business and there is a competitive market that'll put some sort of control on prices. There are some examples of failed privatisations. Perth Airport. Well, it was a government monopoly transferred to a private monopoly, and they've treated it as a property development, not an airport. And so that infrastructure, it's a good example of infrastructure that is always lagging demand. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out what the demand's going to be in air travel as our state develops with its resources sector. And all we have got initially, they were bragging about how it's been a great property development, building warehouses for Coles and all these different places. They should have been building state-of-the-art infrastructure. I travel around the world extensively. I go to third world countries that are building significantly better airport infrastructure than what we have here. So that's, to me, that's the exact...
Taxpayers in those countries.
They what?
Taxpayers pay for it in those countries.
Well, who paid for the airport here? It was the taxpayers built the airport here. They what? No, it should have been sold with key performance indicators in place, where if it was going to remain a monopoly, they should have had performance indicators that gave a priority to providing airport services, not using it as a means to be a pure sort of property development. They've now woken up to it, and we're getting these plans coming out, but they've missed the boat. And the plans I believe that they're putting out, and I say this to the people at the Airport Authority, the plans they're putting out, I believe, are quite dysfunctional designs. So I think it's a good example of a privatisation where they didn't put the proper performance indicators in place. The privatisations that, some of the ones we did, Bank West, nearly sent broke as a government bank. Most of the state banks either went broke or were nearly sent broke, and we were very pleased to get that off the books. Interestingly, when the pipeline was privatised, when the Dampier to Bunbury pipeline was privatised, the land easement was not sold. So the government retained ownership. In fact, we doubled the size of the land easement before that deal went through. And that means that anyone that wants to build a competing gas pipeline doesn't have to worry about getting all the approvals in place, you know, environmental or native title or whatever, because that easement is owned by the state, and that was designed to make it easier for competition in the future to come in. Every government body that is sold has to be done in a different way to take into account what the market situation, whether it's inside the insurance business, the banking business, the transport business, or whatever. Are there any big ones left? In this state, it's probably the power utilities are the main ones, and whatever's done there will be done, I'm sure, to ensure that there are competitive players out in the marketplace.
Lotteries West.
Lotteries West, I think it would be a silly one to privatise.
What?
I think Lotteries West has done a terrific job. One, we've got some control on gambling. We've had a policy here of not allowing the poker machines to go into all the clubs. And they what?
But how do you control online?
Well, that's an issue. That's an issue. And hey, let me answer your question, unless you want to come and give the answer. Gambling is something I don't support. I never supported a casino being built here, and I think everything that we can do to stop a proliferation of gaming machines in hotels is a good thing. And so I do support the Lotteries Commission as a government body.
But on that comment, and I would like to ask Richard ask my personal question. I was recently in a tavern, and you see TAB machines, Richmond races, Randwick races. You know, that's gambling. You know, it's an abhorrence to see people just sitting there wasting their days. We haven't got the pool machines, but we've got the tab machines which just keep taking their dollars, and it doesn't matter whether it's the dogs or the horses, and it comes in from Ascot and the Royal Ascot everywhere else.
Yeah, look, you're right. It's technology's working. We've gone from a 2-up school to pretty sophisticated technology for gambling. So I'm not saying I've got the answers how you control it. I'm just saying I think government shouldn't encourage it.
Why do you want to control it? Like, do you believe in free markets? Or
But yeah, no, look, I don't believe in totally free markets. We have to have some regulation in our society. We have to maintain law and order in our society, and so You know, I think it's important that you have laws and certain regulations, but you can be free market orientated.
Richard, you mentioned China, or actually you mentioned Japan first, slowing down, China potentially melting down, India potential resource buying sector. But West Australia's always had a policy, we can dig it out, we can grow it, we can rear it and sell it. I remember being on a plane years ago and talking to a metallurgist and he's saying, we sell Japan iron ore and they actually process the gold out of that iron ore, and what they processed out of the remaining gold out of that iron ore, they paid for that iron ore, made cars, Nissans or whatever they were making, and sold it back to us a million times profit. But we're doing the same with canola oil, we're doing the same thing with our meat exports at the moment. Russia has sort of condemned some of our exports, you know, so I'm going topical. But what can you see in the future? Because I remember a guy called Lang Hancock and he wanted to create manufacturing. Can you see manufacturing developing in Western Australia, so we're not just exporting the raw minerals and creating Mount Newmans into Lake Newmans again?
Well, I think I've already made the comment that we should be trying to do as much value adding as we can to our primary production, no matter what it is, whether it's in agriculture or in minerals. We have some pretty sophisticated engineers and scientists and the like that are very strong in the mineral processing area. Unfortunately, a lot of their skills are being used in other countries, but I think we should try and encourage as much value adding as we can. There's a gentleman at the back.
Yeah,
Yep.
Mr. Scott, how you going? Lachlan Hunter.
Yep.
You mentioned in your speech several times about royalties in Western Australia. Obviously, previous governments and your father as well have known that most of the wealth created in Western Australia is out in our regions. Do you think now, under this coalition government state, that the royalties for regions plan is working?
Yeah, I think it's been a good initiative without going into the detail of it. I think areas like the Pilbara, Kimberley, they are more difficult places to work. There was a change to the tax laws which was started around the time the Argyle diamond mine was being developed, which was the beginning of this move to fly-in, fly-out operations. And it was a tax-driven move. And I think it's places like Karratha and Headland, they're going to be big communities for many, many decades to come, and there has to be a much stronger focus on providing all the services that families want to live in those areas. And I think Royalties for Regions has started that process. If you take Port Hedland, if your children are going to primary school, they'll get a good education. In secondary school, many of the families shift back to Perth, take their children out of school there, and they attend schools down here. And the standard of the secondary education in a place like Port Hedland is just not what it should be. They don't have the choices, the options for languages, the good maths, science teachers and the like. And that's where we need some initiatives, significantly more initiatives, if we're going to encourage families to make those areas their permanent homes. People love living in Broome and the like. I don't see any reason why a community like Karratha can't become significantly more attractive, lower cost, and with a very high level of services that encourage people to live in those communities. When the first iron ore towns were built under their agreement acts, the companies had to build the towns. They had to commit to the schools and the hospitals and the like in those towns, and they were company towns, and it was proper that they were sort of normalised, so to speak. But I think that the companies and governments need to do more today to move away from the FIFO approaches. It's not a good scene socially. It's difficult for families, and places like Karratha can be, I believe, made to be very attractive places for families to live.
All right, I think we'll leave it there. Mr. Court, I'd like to thank you very much for your time on behalf of the Notre Dame Business Society and the Mancal Economic Education Foundation. Got you just a small gift here.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Richard, Conrad and Danny. Finally, for the evening, we'd like to invite Ron Manners to give a few words. Ron's the founder and chairman of Mancal. Ron.
Thanks, thanks, Paul. One of the joys of being a chairman rather than a CEO now is that I don't have to give long speeches, but I'd like to say just 4 things. Handing over the role I've been running Mancal for 17 years, and handing over is a difficult thing to do with something that you love. And I've got so much confidence in this guy called Paul McCarthy that I'm actually enjoying it. And we've got a tall goal to aim for, finding 105 students to send to these wonderful destinations and these wonderful opportunities. It's a big task, and Paul and Becky Vidler and the rest of our wonderful team there, we've got a huge task. They'll make it. They'll make that goal if they get the support from people like yourselves that I've received over the years. So I'm very thankful of that. That's one thing. The second thing, weren't we lucky to hear from Richard Court tonight? A remarkable Premier who left our state in a much better condition than in which he found it. It's an achievement, Richard, that you've got to be proud of, and we're proud of you. The third point is, why am I so optimistic? Well, this afternoon I spent some time with 5 fabulous young people that we're sending off to Hong Kong for a week to the Montpelier Society Economic Meeting. And what a bunch of people they are. They'll be spending the week, and I'll be there as chaperone, but they'll be spending the week rubbing shoulders with a great bunch of Nobel Prize winning economists from all around the world. But those economists from around the world will learn a hell of a lot from our 5. Give them hell, fellas. And the fourth and final thing was Tom Camp got me thinking about free-range thinking, and it's a great thing to do. Just let your mind run free, and we did a little bit of that this afternoon, and we think there's a fortune to be made if you can solve this problem. And some of you may have seen a news item, I was on the TV last night, about them bringing in an improved version of dung beetles. Do you all know what the dung beetles are? They eat the cow pads and they sort of clean up the mess, and they will prevent an epidemic of flies that we usually get once a year. However, anyone here got a coffee machine that produces these little turd-like brown objects that you find every time you want a cup of coffee you can't, because this thing has got to be emptied. Well, what about we import a dung beetle that likes coffee, and it can just eat those things to their heart out, and we'll never have to empty that coffee machine again. There's a fortune out there for a lateral thinking person. Now listen, I want to draw your attention not on the subject of coffee or dung beetles, but to my lovely wife Jenny Manners, who's a co-director with me at Mancal, along with some other wonderful people. Don't leave tonight without getting to know Jenny and having a few words. She's had a history of 15 years as a school teacher, and then about 23 years as a minder for me, overcoming my inferiority complex and all these other problems that I've always had. Just meet Jenny, and those of you that I haven't talked to tonight, seek us out and say hello and have a bit of it. Give us your news tonight, because we are very concerned about your ongoing process. You've contributed a lot to the richness of our lives, and we want to keep in touch. thank you very much, and congratulations, Paul, and the team for putting such a great event together.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you to Richard and to Tom. You're more than welcome after the speeches now to have some wonderful discussions, and obviously help yourselves to the food and the drinks. Thank you very much.